Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny stood frozen in disbelief on September 12, 1943, as he surveyed the captured American airfield near Foggia, Italy. The elite German commando, Hitler's favorite special operations officer, and the man who had famously rescued Mussolini just days earlier, was tasked with assessing what equipment might be salvaged after the American retreat. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the remainder of the war. Before him stretched row after row of brand new P-47 Thunderbolts and B-24 Liberators, seemingly abandoned without concern as the Americans had tactically withdrawn to more defensible positions. But these weren't damaged aircraft awaiting repair or obsolete models left behind as battlefield refuse. These were pristine, factory-fresh planes that the Luftwaffe would have treasured as frontline equipment. Even more shocking was the sight of American mechanics deliberately destroying perfectly functional aircraft that couldn't be evacuated quickly enough, crushing them with bulldozers rather than risk their capture. "They're destroying more operational aircraft in a single day than we can produce in a month," Skorzeny wrote in his field notebook with shaking hands. What kind of war machine treats such valuable weapons as disposable? What Skorzeny witnessed that autumn day in Italy defied 20 years of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The sight of Americans casually destroying what would have been precious German resources revealed a fundamental truth that would eventually break the spirit of the Third Reich's most devoted officers. They were fighting an industrial giant whose productive capacity operated on a scale that German military planners had not just underestimated, but had fundamentally failed to comprehend. The roots of this fatal miscalculation reached back to January 30th, 1942, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced what seemed to German leadership like an absurd, impossible goal. The United States would build 60,000 aircraft in the coming year, a number that provoked open mockery in Berlin. Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels dismissed the declaration as typical American bluster, while Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, famously remarked to Hitler's inner circle, "If the Americans build 60,000 planes, then I am Mickey Mouse." The Führer himself addressed the claim in a speech at the Berlin Sportpalast on February 15, 1942, drawing uproarious laughter from the assembled crowd when he sarcastically suggested that, perhaps, this Roosevelt is confusing production with his beloved Hollywood movie props. The German leadership's dismissal was rooted in what seemed like solid reasoning. In 1941, the entire American aircraft industry had produced just under 20,000 planes, many of obsolete design. Germany's own production, refined through years of rearmament and wartime experience, had reached a highly efficient 14,000 aircraft annually. The idea that America could triple its output while converting its civilian industries to wartime production, training an entirely new workforce, and simultaneously fighting a two-front war against experienced Axis powers seemed logistically impossible to German military planners. Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, had studied American industrial capacity more carefully than most of his colleagues and expressed rare concern about Roosevelt's proclamation. "Americans have a gift for mechanization and mass production that we would be foolish to underestimate," he cautioned in a February 1942 naval staff meeting. But his warning was dismissed by Hitler's armaments minister Albert Speer, who insisted that American manufacturing may excel at refrigerators and automobiles, but the precision engineering required for modern warfare is another matter entirely. This fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capability would prove to be one of the most consequential intelligence failures in military history. The Germans believed, quite simply, that quality would triumph over quantity, that their superior engineering, experienced workforce, and disciplined production methods would overcome whatever numbers the chaotic American factories might eventually produce. What they failed to grasp was that American industry was about to achieve both quality and quantity on a scale that would render German production philosophies obsolete. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, produced a comprehensive assessment of American aircraft production capacity in March 1942, concluding that the absolute maximum output possible from all American factories combined could not exceed 40,000 aircraft annually, and even this figure was considered optimistically high. This report, which reached Hitler's desk, reinforced his conviction that Roosevelt's 60,000 plane promise was empty rhetoric designed to boost American morale and intimidate the Axis powers. Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, noted, in the report's conclusion, "The Americans face insurmountable obstacles in skilled labor shortage, raw material constraints, and the logistical challenges of converting civilian factories to military production." The report estimated it would take until at least 1944 before American aircraft could make any meaningful impact on the European theater. Hitler was so convinced of this timeline that he revised the Kriegsmarine's U-boat construction program on the assumption that America would be unable to produce sufficient long-range aircraft to close the mid-Atlantic air gap before 1944, giving German submarines at least 2 more years of relatively safe hunting in what they called the American shooting gallery. By the end of 1942, the first cracks in this confidence began to appear. American aircraft were arriving in Britain in unexpected numbers, and intelligence reports from German agents in the United States painted a worrying picture of vast new aircraft factories rising from empty fields in California, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Michigan. A classified Luftwaffe intelligence assessment dated December 10, 1942, reluctantly admitted that American production had likely reached approximately 47,000 aircraft for the year, still short of Roosevelt's boast, but far more than German experts had deemed possible. Hermann Goering dismissed these figures as enemy propaganda and ordered a revision of the report, unwilling to accept that his dismissive Mickey Mouse comment might need to be reconsidered. Hitler, meanwhile, prohibited the circulation of the original report beyond his immediate military advisors, concerned about its potential impact on German morale. What the German leadership didn't know, couldn't comprehend, was that American production was just beginning to accelerate. Roosevelt's 60,000 aircraft had never been the actual target, but merely the publicly announced goal. The real production targets established by the War Production Board were even more ambitious, calling for a progressive ramping up that would reach peak production in 1944. While German intelligence was struggling to accept the 47,000 aircraft produced in 1942, American planners were already coordinating the supply chains, workforce training, and factory expansions that would eventually produce over 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. The true scope of American industrial mobilization remained hidden from German leadership, who continued to evaluate American capabilities through the lens of their own production limitations and pre-war assumptions. This failure of imagination would prove devastating as the air war intensified over Europe. The human dimension of this production miracle was equally incomprehensible to German military thinking. While the Nazi regime had to resort to slave labor and the ruthless exploitation of conquered territories to maintain their war production, America was experiencing a social and economic transformation through voluntary participation. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, with the iconic Rosie the Riveter becoming the public face of female factory workers who had never before held industrial jobs. Retired workers returned to active employment, and innovative training programs converted farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives into skilled aircraft builders in a matter of weeks, rather than the years of apprenticeship that German manufacturing traditions demanded. By mid-1943, the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, a factory built by the Ford Motor Company specifically to mass-produce B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, was rolling out one complete bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. The entire facility had been an empty field just 18 months earlier. As Lieutenant Colonel Scoresny continued his inspection of the abandoned American airfield near Foggia that September day in 1943, he encountered something that shattered his professional composure. A maintenance hangar contained not just spare parts, but entire warehouse sections of factory new aircraft engines, Pratt & Whitney R2000 twin Wasp engines, still in their shipping crates, each capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. Scoresny, who had extensive knowledge of Germany's increasingly desperate aircraft maintenance situation, knew that Luftwaffe mechanics were being forced to cannibalize damaged aircraft and recondition worn parts to keep their dwindling fleet operational. Yet here were dozens of brand new engines apparently considered so easily replaceable that they hadn't been worth the Americans' effort to evacuate or destroy. He ordered his men to prepare the engines for immediate transport to Germany, knowing their immense value to the struggling Luftwaffe, only to discover another shock. The American mechanics had removed a single critical component from each engine before retreating, rendering the otherwise pristine power plants useless without replacement parts that Germany could not manufacture. These Americans are not just our industrial superiors, Scoresny wrote in his personal diary that evening, a document that would only be discovered after the war. They have achieved such abundance that they can afford to think and act in ways we cannot comprehend. They destroy what we would treasure, they abandon what we would hoard, and they produce what we can only envy. His report to Berlin was considerably more circumspect, emphasizing the equipment that had been successfully captured while downplaying the evidence of American industrial superiority. Like many German officers who encountered the reality of American production capacity firsthand, Scoresny found himself caught between professional duty to report accurately and the knowledge that such reports increasingly contradicted the official narrative maintained by Nazi leadership. This cognitive dissonance would become a common experience among German officers as the war progressed, creating a growing gap between frontline reality and strategic planning. Major Heinrich Brandt of the Luftwaffe's technical office experienced his own moment of revelation in February 1943 when he was assigned to examine a captured B-17 flying fortress that had made an emergency landing in occupied France. As an aircraft engineer who had worked on the development of Germany's own four-engine bomber, the troubled Heinkel, He-177, Brandt approached the examination with professional curiosity and a degree of skepticism about American engineering. What he discovered inside the bomber left him profoundly disturbed. The Americans have solved problems we are still struggling with, he noted in his official report. Their electrical systems are standardized and modular. Their hydraulics are more reliable yet simpler than our own. But most shocking is the evidence of mass production. Parts that we would laboriously handcraft are clearly stamped out by machines with a degree of precision our best craftsmen would struggle to match. Brandt's most disturbing discovery came when he examined the bomber's ball turret mechanism. The complex spherical gun mount contained precision bearings that, in Germany, would have been painstakingly manufactured by highly skilled machinists. The American version showed clear evidence of mass production, yet when Brandt tested the mechanism, it moved with a smoothness that German engineering could not consistently achieve, even with hand-finished components. They have accomplished what we thought impossible, Brandt wrote. They have mechanized precision. When he returned to Germany, Brandt requested permission to incorporate some of the American design elements into German aircraft. His request was denied on the grounds that retooling production lines would temporarily reduce output, a luxury the stretched German aircraft industry could not afford. Instead, he was ordered to focus on simplifying existing German designs, to maximize production with increasingly scarce skilled labor. The contrast between American and German approaches to the same problem, America scaling up production while improving quality, Germany sacrificing quality to maintain inadequate quantity, revealed a fundamental divergence in industrial philosophy that would ultimately determine the outcome of the air war. The reality of American production was becoming increasingly difficult for the German High Command to ignore by mid-1943. Intelligence reports, captured equipment, and the growing intensity of Allied bombing all pointed to an uncomfortable truth. Not only had Roosevelt's 60,000 aircraft promise been met, but it had been surpassed. The United States had produced over 85,000 aircraft in 1943 alone, while German production struggled to reach 25,000, many of which were obsolescent models kept in production because retooling factories for newer designs would temporarily reduce output. The quality gap was widening as well. American aircraft were increasingly equipped with technological advances that Germany could not match at scale. Reliable turbochargers, efficient self-sealing, fuel tanks, superior radio equipment, and effective de-icing systems. Individual German aircraft might still be superior in specific performance metrics, but the overwhelming numerical advantage, combined with the narrowing quality gap, meant that the Luftwaffe was fighting an increasingly impossible battle. Hermann Göring, whose dismissive Mickey Mouse comment had once drawn appreciative laughter from Hitler's inner circle, found himself increasingly isolated as the disparity became impossible to ignore. In a moment of rare candor during a private meeting with Luftwaffe generals in August 1943, Göring reportedly admitted, "If I had known in 1941 what I know now about American industrial capacity, I would have advised against declaring war on the United States." This remarkable statement, recorded in the diary of General Adolf Galland, was never repeated publicly, and Göring continued to promise Hitler miraculous reversals of fortune through new aircraft designs and production methods. But among the eyes, Luftwaffe's senior leadership, the recognition of America's industrial superiority had become an unspoken, demoralizing reality. The Air Force that had once terrified Europe was being systematically overwhelmed not just by numbers but by industrial philosophy. For ordinary German pilots, the evidence was even more direct and deadly. Luftwaffe ace Werner Mulders, who had shot down 28 enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain, wrote to his brother in April 1943, "We no longer encounter the occasional American formation. Now they come in waves that stretch from horizon to horizon. Their escort fighters outnumber us 5-1, and when we shoot one down, 5 more appear. It is no longer a battle of skill, but a battle of endurance. They can afford to lose 10 aircraft for each one of ours, and they know it." Mulders would not survive to see how prescient his assessment was. He was shot down and killed 3 weeks after writing that letter, one of the growing number of experienced German pilots whose loss further tilted the balance against the Luftwaffe. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing trained pilots faster than they could be replaced, creating a downward spiral of diminishing experience and effectiveness that no technological innovation could overcome. The human cost of this disparity extended beyond combat losses. As Allied bombing disrupted transportation networks across occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe's training program collapsed. Fuel shortages reduced flying hours for new pilots from 200 in 1940 to less than 50 by 1944. American pilots, meanwhile, received over 400 hours of training before entering combat, flying the same aircraft types they would use operationally, with abundant fuel for practice. The result was predictable and devastating. Inexperienced German pilots facing veteran American crews in inferior numbers with inadequate training. By 1944, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot on the Western Front had dropped to 3 weeks. The Americans, by contrast, had instituted a rotation system that allowed experienced crews to return home after completing a specified number of missions, where they could train the next generation of aviators, creating a continuously improving force while Germany's degraded with each irreplaceable loss. The disparity in industrial capacity became personal for Oberleutnant Karl Müller when he was shot down over England in June 1943 and became a prisoner of war. Müller, who had served as a production supervisor at the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg before the war, was transported to a POW camp in Texas. His first letter home revealed the psychological impact of witnessing American abundance firsthand. The camp where I am held is better constructed than the workers' housing at our aircraft factory. We receive food that has become a distant memory in Germany. Eggs, meat, butter, and fruit in quantities that seem wasteful. Yesterday, I watched as a guard threw away half a sandwich that would feed a German family for a day. When I asked why, he shrugged and said there would be more tomorrow. Miller's letters, which were reviewed by military censors, became increasingly philosophical as he struggled to reconcile his previous beliefs with what he was witnessing. "I'm gaining weight in captivity while I know my family grows thinner in freedom," he wrote in September 1943. "Something is deeply wrong with the world we have created." As a former aircraft production specialist, Miller was particularly affected by a camp visit from a civilian aircraft worker who had come to see captured enemy pilots. The American, an employee at the nearby North American aviation factory producing P-51 Mustangs, casually mentioned production figures that Miller initially assumed were propaganda. When he expressed his disbelief, the American worker invited Miller to write down what he thought American monthly production might be. Miller, drawing on his professional experience, calculated the maximum feasible output for a factory of the size described to him, 80 fighters per month. The American laughed and informed him the actual figure was over 300, with a second production line being prepared that would double that number. "I accused him of lying," Miller wrote in his memoirs after the war. "He simply shrugged and said, 'Why would I bother? You'll see for yourself when the war is over.' That casual confidence affected me more deeply than any propaganda ever could. He wasn't trying to intimidate me. He genuinely saw no reason to exaggerate what to him was simply everyday reality. The impact of American production was not limited to aircraft. Captain Friedrich Paulus, a German tank commander captured during the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, experienced a similar revelation regarding American logistical capabilities. As he was being transported to a POW collection point, he witnessed the unloading of an American supply ship. "The Americans have refrigerated transport ships bringing fresh food to the front lines," he wrote in a censored letter to his family. "Their ordinary soldiers eat from cans food that would be officers' rations in our army. Their equipment is not individually superior to ours, but every soldier has everything he needs. And when something breaks, it is immediately replaced rather than repaired." Paulus, who had commanded a company of Tigers, tanks so valuable to Germany that damaged ones were always recovered and repaired if physically possible, was astonished to see Americans abandoning vehicles with minor mechanical problems, treating them as disposable assets rather than precious resources. "They leave behind perfectly functional equipment that needs only minor repairs," he noted with professional dismay. "Their supply chain simply replaces it faster than it would take to fix." For Hitler and the Nazi leadership, maintaining the Us-Ich myth of German technological superiority became increasingly difficult as the war progressed. Joseph Goebbels' diaries reveal a growing private acknowledgement of the reality, even as public propaganda continued to insist on eventual victory. "The Führer was shown comparative production figures today," Goebbels wrote on April 4, 1943. "The American numbers are so far beyond our capacity that he initially refused to believe them. When convinced of their accuracy, he fell into a dark mood from which even news from the Eastern Front could not rouse him." Hitler's response to this growing production gap was to place increasingly desperate hope in wonder weapons, technological leaps that would supposedly nullify America's numerical advantage. The V-weapons program, jet aircraft development, and other advanced projects consumed resources that might have been better used to maximize conventional production, further exacerbating Germany's industrial disadvantage. Albert Speer, Reich, Minister of Armaments and War Production, was among the first Nazi leaders to fully comprehend the true scale of American industrial capacity. After receiving detailed intelligence reports in late 1943, including aerial reconnaissance photographs of American aircraft factories, Speer conducted a comprehensive reassessment of the strategic situation. His conclusions were so alarming that he requested a private audience with Hitler to present them without other officials present. According to Speer's post-war writings, he informed Hitler that American aircraft production had exceeded 100,000 planes. Since their entry into the war, with monthly production now surpassing Germany's annual output, Hitler initially refused to accept these figures, accusing his intelligence services of defeatism and exaggeration. When Speer insisted on their accuracy, Hitler reportedly responded, "Then we have lost the war." This moment of clarity was brief, however, as Hitler quickly returned to fantasies of secret weapons and political divisions among the Allies that would somehow reverse Germany's deteriorating position. The reality of American production capacity became increasingly difficult to hide from the German public, as Allied bombing intensified through 1943 and 1944. Civilians in German cities experienced nightly raids by hundreds of bombers, each carrying a bomb load heavier than entire Luftwaffe formations could deliver. The contrast between German propaganda, which had long claimed air superiority and promised retaliation in kind, and the lived experience of unrelenting bombardment created a credibility gap that even Goebbels' skilled propaganda machine could not bridge. A Sicherheitsdienst SD internal security report from November 1943 noted growing civilian skepticism. Citizens increasingly question how, if our air defenses are as effective as claimed, such massive enemy formations can reach our cities night after night. The discrepancy between official casualty figures and what people witness in their own neighborhoods is creating dangerous levels of distrust in official information. For German pilots transferred from the Eastern Front to defend the Reich, the scale of American air operations came as a profound shock. Major Anton Haeckel, an experienced fighter ace with over 100 victories against Soviet aircraft, described his first encounter with American bomber formations in his combat report dated January 18, 1944. I had been told to expect large formations, but nothing prepared me for the reality. The bomber stream extended beyond visual range, with escort fighters above, below, and on all sides. My entire squadron could attack only the smallest fraction of their formation. For every aircraft we engaged, 50 more continued undisturbed to their target. This is not aerial combat as we have known it. It is industrial warfare in the skies, and we are the craftsmen facing the assembly line. Haeckel survived the war, but many of his colleagues did not, as the Luftwaffe suffered unsustainable losses trying to oppose bomber formations of 500 or more aircraft, each representing more industrial capacity than Germany could replace in a month of production. The psychological impact of this disparity reached its peak during Operation Argument, known to Allied airmen as Big Week, in February 1944. Over 6 consecutive days, the United States 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command launched the largest coordinated bombing campaign yet seen, targeting German aircraft factories with over 3,500 bomber sorties. The message was unmistakable. American production was now so overwhelming that they could afford to commit their bombers specifically to destroying Germany's ability to produce aircraft, creating a vicious cycle from which the Luftwaffe could not recover. German fighters rose to oppose these raids at unsustainable loss rates, with over 30% of the available defensive force destroyed in a single week. Hermann Göring, once the proud creator of the Luftwaffe, reportedly broke down during a staff meeting when presented with the losses, shouting at his subordinates, "What do you want me to do? The enemy has 5 times our numbers. Am I supposed to manufacture fighters out of my uniform decorations?" His outburst revealed the fundamental truth that no amount of German efficiency, engineering excellence, or tactical skill could overcome the basic mathematical reality of American production. For ordinary Germans, the collapse of Luftwaffe defensive capabilities shattered a fundamental promise of the Nazi regime. Since 1940, Göring had repeatedly assured the German people that enemy bombers would never reach the Reich in significant numbers. As 1,000 bomber raids became routine by mid-1944, this broken promise contributed to a broader erosion of confidence in Nazi leadership. A German civil defense worker in Hamburg wrote in his diary after the devastating raids of July 1943, "We were told America was a decadent nation of jazz musicians and movie stars. incapable of the discipline needed for war production. Yet they send more bombers over our city in a single night than we have produced in the past year. Someone has been lying to us, and the truth is falling from the sky in the form of American bombs. This sentiment, though never publicly expressed in such direct terms, due to fear of the Gestapo, became increasingly common in private conversations among German civilians as the disparity between propaganda and reality became impossible to ignore. The final confirmation of American industrial dominance came not through combat, but through scientific analysis. In early 1944, the German War Economy Ministry conducted a secret study of aluminum consumption in aircraft production, comparing verified American output with German resources. The conclusions were stark. America was now devoting more aluminum to aircraft production each month than Germany could produce in an entire year, even if every other military and civilian use was eliminated. The study's authors concluded, the disparity is now so great that no tactical or technological advantage can compensate. We are fighting an opponent who can replace their entire air fleet every few months, while we struggle to maintain even minimal operational strength. Hitler ordered the study classified at the highest level, and its authors were reassigned to unrelated duties, a typical response to unwelcome information that characterized the Reich's increasingly dysfunctional decision-making process in the war's later years. For Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, whose encounter with American abundance at Foggia had first revealed the true scale of the production disparity, the war's outcome had become a mathematical certainty by early 1944. Though he continued to execute special operations with his customary skill and daring, his private writings reveal a growing recognition of the inevitable. After a mission to Hungary in March 1944, he wrote, "We are fighting not just armies but factories. The enemy's greatest weapon is not their tanks or planes or ships, but their smokestack. Against this, no tactical brilliance or individual heroism can prevail." Skorzeny, like many professional German officers, found himself in the impossible position of recognizing the war was lost while being unable to act on that knowledge without committing treason. This cognitive dissonance, fighting for a cause they knew was doomed, contributed to the psychological collapse of the German military leadership in the war's final year. As Allied forces advanced into Germany itself in early 1945, the full extent of American production capacity became visible to ordinary German citizens. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division described the reaction of civilians in the Ruhr Valley to the passing American columns. They stood in silence, watching endless convoys of vehicles, not just tanks and trucks, but specialized equipment of types we had never seen. One old man who had worked at Krupp before the war turned to me and asked, "How could we have believed we could defeat this?" I had no answer for him. The America they were seeing with their own eyes bore no resemblance to the America they had been told about for 12 years. The physical evidence of American industrial might, the seemingly infinite supply of vehicles, aircraft, weapons, and equipment, accomplished what years of strategic bombing had not. It shattered the myth of German superiority that had sustained civilian morale despite increasing hardship. For German prisoners of war in American camps, the contrast between propaganda and reality often led to a profound reevaluation of their most basic beliefs. Feldwebel, Sergeant Werner Kleist, captured in France shortly after D-Day, described this transformation in a diary he kept secretly during his captivity. We were told Americans were soft, undisciplined, and racially mixed, which made them inferior soldiers. Yet they defeated us with overwhelming force while treating us with a humanity that our own propaganda said they lacked. The abundance in this POW camp exceeds what many Germans experienced even before the war. If they were lying about this, what else was a lie? This question, what else was a lie, became the foundation for a post-war reckoning that would transform German society. Many former POWs, having experienced American industrial and cultural realities firsthand, returned to Germany as unofficial ambassadors for democratic capitalism, helping to facilitate Germany's remarkable post-war economic reconstruction and integration into Western political structures. The final statistical reckoning of American aircraft production revealed numbers that would have been dismissed as fantastical propaganda had they been presented to German leadership in 1942. Between December 7th, 1941, and August 14th, 1945, American factories produced 296,700 aircraft, nearly 6 times the production of Nazi Germany during the same period. This included 95,000 heavy bombers, each requiring more aluminum, rubber, and specialized equipment than 10 German fighter aircraft. Even more remarkably, this unprecedented aircraft production represented only a fraction of America's overall industrial output. During the same period, the United States also produced 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and 71,000 naval vessels, along with the millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and supplies needed to keep these weapon systems operational across two global theaters of war. The most telling statistic, however, may be one that emerged only through post-war economic analysis. At its wartime peak, American aircraft production consumed only 8% of the nation's industrial capacity. Germany, by contrast, was devoting nearly 40% of its industrial resources to aircraft production by 1944, achieving less than a quarter of American output while critically shortchanging other essential sectors of its war economy. This fundamental disparity revealed the true nature of the conflict, not simply a war between armies, but between economic systems and industrial philosophies. The American system of standardized mass production, which German engineers had often dismissed as creating inferior products, had evolved to deliver both quantity and quality at a scale that traditional European manufacturing methods could not approach. American aircraft were not only more numerous, but by 1944 were technically superior in most performance metrics to their German counterparts, decisively refuting the Nazi assumption that mass production necessarily meant inferior quality. For post-war Germany, the lessons of this industrial disparity became the foundation for economic rebirth. German manufacturers who had witnessed American production methods, either as prisoners of war or through the Marshall Plan's technical exchange programs, revolutionized their approaches to manufacturing. The German economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s was built on a synthesis of traditional German engineering excellence with American mass production techniques and management philosophies. Companies like Volkswagen, which had produced military vehicles during the war, transformed themselves into global industrial powers by adopting and improving upon the very American production methods that had once overwhelmed them as enemies. The lasting legacy of America's wartime production miracle was not just victory in conflict, but the transformation of its former adversary into an economic ally that would help anchor European prosperity and security for generations to come. The human dimension of this transformation was embodied by individuals like Carl Miller, the former Messerschmitt production supervisor, who had been so affected by his experiences as a prisoner of war in Texas. After returning to Germany in 1946, Miller eventually secured a position with the emerging Volkswagen company, where he helped implement production techniques he had observed in America. The greatest irony, he wrote in his memoirs published in 1978, is that the industrial methods that defeated us became our salvation. What I once viewed with disbelief as a prisoner became the foundation of my life's work, as a free man. Miller was one of thousands of German industrial specialists whose wartime exposure to American abundance led to a post-war revolution in German manufacturing philosophy, transforming a devastated nation into an economic powerhouse within a single generation. The story of American aircraft production represents more than just a military or industrial triumph. It reveals how material reality can shatter ideological conviction. Nazi propaganda had created an image of America as a decadent, racially mixed society incapable of disciplined quality production. The reality of encountering not just American goods, but the philosophy that produced them, forced a fundamental reevaluation among those Germans who experienced it directly. Werner Kleist, the sergeant whose secret diary questioned what else might have been a lie, returned to Germany and eventually became a schoolteacher in Bavaria, where he made a point of teaching his students to question authority and evaluate evidence for themselves. "My American captivity freed me twice," he wrote in a letter to a former American guard in 1962. "First from the war, and then from the thinking that had led us into it." For Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, whose moment of realization at Foggia opened our story, the lessons of American industrial might lead to a surprising post-war transformation. Though he escaped Allied captivity and spent years in exile before being cleared of war crimes, Skorzeny eventually established a successful engineering and import-export business that facilitated technical exchanges between American and European manufacturers. The man once known as Hitler's Commando became an advocate for international trade and standardized manufacturing practices, writing in a 1967 business journal, "The future belongs not to the heroic individual or the master, craftsman, but to systems of production that harness human creativity through standardization and scalability." His journey from Nazi true believer to international businessman reflected the broader transformation of German society, a transformation catalyzed by direct exposure to the industrial reality that had rendered their previous worldview obsolete. The final verdict on this transformation came not from military historians or economists, but from the American occupation authorities who surveyed German prisoners of war before their repatriation. When asked what had most changed their view of America during their captivity, the most common response was not related to military power or political freedom, but to material abundance and its distribution throughout society. A typical response, recorded from an unnamed Wehrmacht corporal in August 1945, captures this revelation. In Germany, we were told that Americans had many cars and refrigerators because they exploited workers and conquered peoples. As a prisoner, I saw that American guards, ordinary men from ordinary families, lived better than our officers. They owned automobiles, sent their children to universities, and ate food we considered luxuries. This was not propaganda I could see with my own eyes. It was a reality that contradicted everything we had been taught about the relationship between production and social order. This recognition that industrial efficiency could create broad prosperity rather than merely enriching the elite became the cornerstone of Germany's post-war social market economy, combining elements of capitalism and social welfare in a system that would have been unimaginable under Nazi ideology. Hermann Goering, whose dismissive Mickey Mouse comment about American production goals had once seemed so confidently appropriate, offered a final reflection on this disparity during his Nuremberg trial. When questioned about Germany's strategic miscalculations, Goering replied, "The fundamental underestimation was of American productive capacity. We judges everything by European standards and had no conception of American industrial potential. When I saw the first reports of their production figures, I thought there had been a decimal point error. I believe this was our single greatest mistake, not just underestimating what they could produce, but failing to understand how they produced it." This rare moment of clarity from one of the Nazi regime's chief architects underscores the fundamental nature of the miscalculation. It was not merely a quantitative error, but a qualitative failure to comprehend an entirely different system of industrial organization and its implications for warfare. The legacy of America's wartime production miracle extended far beyond military victory or even Germany's post-war transformation. It established a model of industrial mobilization that would influence global manufacturing for decades to come, demonstrating that standardization, assembly line production, and interchangeable parts could achieve both quantity and quality when properly implemented. The methods that produced 296,000 aircraft in less than 4 years would later be adapted to create the consumer abundance of the post-war era, making automobiles, household appliances, and eventually electronics available to ordinary citizens on a scale previously unimaginable. The American century that followed World War II was built not just on military triumph, but on the production philosophy that had made that triumph possible. A philosophy that transformed not only America's enemies, but America itself, creating the world's first truly mass consumer society. What made this transformation particularly powerful was its visibility to those who had once dismissed American capabilities. Former Luftwaffe pilot Heinrich Schultz, who settled in Milwaukee after marrying an American nurse he met as a prisoner. Of war, wrote in his 1973 autobiography, "The America that Nazi propaganda described to us was a phantom, a distorted shadow of the reality. We were told of racial strife that made coordinated production impossible, of labor disputes that paralyzed factories, of decadence that undermined work ethic. What I found instead was a society where assembly line workers owned their own homes, and automobiles, where racial cooperation in factories achieved production miracles, and where the decadence we were warned about was simply a different conception of what prosperity should look like. The greatest victory of American industry was not the defeat of our armies, but the destruction of our assumptions about what was economically possible. This destruction of assumptions had profound implications for the post-war order. The economics miracle that transformed West Germany from a devastated nation into a prosperous democracy within a single generation was built on lessons learned directly from American production philosophy. Ludwig Erhard, the economist who designed West Germany's post-war economic reforms, specifically cited exposure to American industrial methods as a key influence. What we learned from America, Erhard stated in a 1962 speech, was not just techniques of production, but a philosophy of abundance. The old European model assumed scarcity as the natural condition and designed economic systems to manage it. The American innovation was to assume abundance as the goal and design systems to create it. This fundamental shift in perspective, from managing scarcity to creating abundance, transformed not just Germany, but eventually much of Western Europe through the economic integration that would later evolve into the European Union. For the Soviet Union, America's production achievements presented a different kind of challenge. While Soviet propaganda continued to predict the inevitable collapse of capitalism well into the Cold War era, Soviet economic planners who had seen American production capabilities firsthand during wartime alliance cooperation harbored private doubts. Andrei Sakharov, who would later become a dissident but was initially a privileged physicist within the Soviet system, described a telling moment in his memoirs. In 1946, I attended a closed briefing where our aviation experts presented an analysis of American aircraft production during the war. The figures were so extraordinary that a Politburo member interrupted to ask if there had been an error in translation. When assured the numbers were accurate, he fell silent, then said, "If they could build 200,000 aircraft while fighting a two-front war, how many could they build if they focused solely on destroying us?" That question haunted Soviet military planning for decades. This recognition of American productive potential became a central factor in Soviet strategic thinking throughout the Cold War, contributing to the arms race, but also to the reluctance to risk direct military confrontation. The psychological impact of American industrial abundance extended beyond former enemies to include former colonies throughout Asia and Africa. Japanese economic planners, rebuilding their nation under American occupation, studied wartime production methods with particular attention. Taiichi Ohno, who later developed the Toyota production system that would revolutionize global manufacturing, in the 1970s and 80s explicitly cited American wartime production as his initial inspiration. "What impressed me most about the Americans," Ohno wrote, "was not just their output, but their constant improvement of the production process itself. Each aircraft model incorporated lessons from the previous one, and their factories were constantly redesigning themselves to remove inefficiencies. This was a revelation, the idea that the production system itself should be the product of continuous improvement." The Toyota production system that evolved from these observations would eventually influence manufacturing methods worldwide, coming full circle as American companies adopted Japanese improvements on the original American innovations. Perhaps the most profound legacy of America's wartime production achievement was its demonstration of the relationship between industrial capability and political freedom. The Nazi regime had assumed that its authoritarian control would provide advantages in mobilizing national resources, believing that democratic inefficiencies like labor rights, public opinion, and civilian consumption would hamper America's war production. The opposite proved true. America's democratic system, with its emphasis on individual initiative, education, and social mobility, created a more adaptive and ultimately more productive industrial base than Germany's increasingly coercive system. As German POW Manfred Romer wrote after attending a technical college in Michigan following the war, "The most surprising aspect of American production was not the machines, but the minds behind them. Factory workers suggested improvements that in Germany would have required an engineer's approval. Women designed aircraft components that male engineers then implemented. This openness to talent, regardless of its source, gave America an adaptability we could never match under the rigid hierarchies of National Socialism." This observation, that political freedom and industrial productivity were complementary rather than contradictory, became a cornerstone of Cold War economic theory and practice in the Western world. For the generation of Germans who experienced this revelation firsthand, the impact was deeply personal. Walter Kruger, a Messerschmitt test pilot captured in North Africa in 1943, experienced the contrast between propaganda and reality in particularly dramatic fashion. Upon arrival at a POW camp in Oklahoma, Kruger was shocked to discover that the camp was located adjacent to a B-24 production facility. Through the camp fence, he could observe the continuous flow of heavy bombers emerging from the factory, more aircraft each week than he had seen produced in a month at Messerschmitt. The truly disturbing aspect, Kruger wrote in a letter smuggled to his brother through a Red Cross package, is not the number of aircraft, but the people producing them. The factory workers include women, elderly men, and people of various races working together with an efficiency our propaganda said was impossible in a democracy. They are not driven by fear, but by something else, a sense of purpose and cooperation that produces more aircraft with apparent ease than our desperate exertions can match. This recognition that democratic motivation could outproduce authoritarian coercion represented a fundamental challenge to fascist ideology that no military defeat alone could have accomplished. By 1944, the disparity between American and German production had become so extreme that it affected basic tactical decisions on both sides. American fighter pilots were instructed to prioritize destroying German aircraft over protecting their bombers if given the choice, knowing that America could replace lost bombers more easily than Germany could replace lost fighters. German pilots, conversely, were ordered to avoid combat except under optimal conditions, preserving their irreplaceable aircraft and skills. This asymmetric approach to aerial warfare reflected the underlying industrial reality. American aircraft were increasingly treated as consumable items in a war of attrition, while German aircraft had become precious assets to be conserved. As Luftwaffe, General Adolf Galland bitterly observed in February 1944, "We have reached the point where we must consider each of our fighters worth 10 of the enemy's. The Americans, meanwhile, can afford to consider each of their aircraft expendable if it results in the destruction of even one of ours. This is no longer a contest of aerial combat, but a mathematical equation that can have only one outcome." The ultimate irony of Hitler's dismissal of Roosevelt's 60,000 aircraft pledge was that it represented a failure of imagination that doomed his regime. By 1944, American factories were producing 2,500 aircraft per week, achieving in just over 20 days what Hitler had mockingly dismissed as impossible in a year. This production miracle was accomplished not through superhuman effort or revolutionary technology, but through the systematic application of manufacturing principles that had been developed in American automotive and consumer goods industries during the preceding decades. The assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford for the Model T were adapted and enhanced for aircraft production, creating factories where raw materials entered one end and completed bombers or fighters emerged from the other, in a continuous flow that German industrial planners could scarcely comprehend, let alone match. For ordinary German soldiers encountering American equipment on the battlefield, the production disparity manifested in ways both large and small. Infantry Sergeant Klaus Weber, fighting in the Hürtgen Forest in November 1944, described his unit's astonishment at captured American supplies. "Each American soldier carried more canned food than our squad received in a week. Their uniforms had zippered pockets and waterproof coatings we could only dream of. Even their entrenching tools were superior, mass-produced yet better designed than our handcrafted equipment. Most shocking were their medical kits, containing drugs our own doctors could rarely obtain. We had been told their material abundance made them soft, but we discovered instead that it made them nearly impossible to defeat. They could afford to make mistakes we could not, take casualties we could not replace, and expend ammunition we had to conserve." This ground-level experience of American abundance had a demoralizing effect that tactical successes could not overcome. The growing recognition among German soldiers that they were fighting not just an enemy army, but an enemy economy that operated on a scale their own nation could not approach. After the war, as the full statistics of American production became known, former Nazi officials struggled to explain how they could have so fundamentally misjudged their opponent. Albert Speer, speaking to American interrogators in 1945, offered perhaps the most honest assessment. "We were deceived not by your intelligence services, but by our own preconceptions. We believed that a nation of immigrants could not be unified in purpose, that a democracy could not organize effectively for war, and that capitalist production could not be directed toward national goals without a strong authoritarian state. We projected our own limitations onto you and assumed that because we could not have achieved such production, neither could anyone else. In this, we were not just wrong, but wrong in the most fundamental way possible." This admission, that the failure was one of imagination rather than information, reveals the deepest impact of American wartime production. It demonstrated possibilities that authoritarian thinking had deemed impossible, expanding the boundaries of what industrial society could achieve. The aircraft factories themselves became almost mythical in German military consciousness. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford to mass-produce B-24 Liberators, achieved a production rate of one complete four-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes at its peak, more bombers each day than the entire German aircraft industry could produce in a week. When informed of this production rate in late 1943, Hitler reportedly dismissed it as a physical impossibility and ordered the intelligence officer who presented the information to be investigated for spreading defeatism. Yet, the reality was even more impressive than the statistics suggested. Willow Run had been an empty field in 1941. By 1943, it housed the largest factory under a single roof in the world, employing over 42,000 workers, many of whom had never seen an aircraft before their employment. The plant did not merely assemble aircraft from parts manufactured elsewhere. It transformed raw aluminum, rubber, and steel into completed bombers through a production process that integrated thousands of operations into a continuous flow. This achievement represented not just a quantitative advantage, but a qualitative revolution in industrial organization that German manufacturing tradition, with its emphasis on craftsmanship and specialized production, could not match at scale. For Japan, America's second major Axis opponent, the production disparity was even more extreme. While Germany managed to increase its aircraft production despite Allied bombing, reaching peak output in 1944, Japan's production collapsed under the combined pressures of resource shortages and strategic bombing. By 1945, Japan was losing aircraft at 4 times its replacement rate, with untrained pilots flying increasingly obsolescent models against overwhelming American air power. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and later toured Japanese aircraft factories in 1945, wrote a despairing report to Imperial headquarters. What I witnessed at Nakajima and Mitsubishi cannot be called mass production by any modern standard. We are still essentially hand-building aircraft, while the Americans have industrialized warfare to a degree we cannot comprehend, let alone match. Their newest fighters and bombers are not only more numerous, but technically superior in almost every respect. This war has become a contest between our spiritual strength and their material abundance, and material factors are proving decisive. This recognition, that industrial capacity could overcome even the most dedicated spiritual or ideological commitment, represented a profound challenge to Japanese military thinking that had emphasized spirit over material factors throughout the country's modern history. The aircraft production miracle had significant social implications within America as well. The massive expansion of manufacturing created opportunities for groups previously marginalized in industrial employment, particularly women and racial minorities. The iconic Rosie the Riveter represented over 6 million women who entered the industrial workforce during the war, many working directly in aircraft production. At Boeing's Seattle plant, the workforce expanded from 4,000 to over 47,000 workers between 1941 and 1944, with women eventually constituting nearly 40% of the total. African Americans, who had been largely excluded from skilled industrial work before the war, gained unprecedented access to manufacturing jobs, though often still facing discrimination within the workplace. The successful integration of these previously untapped labor pools demonstrated that diversity could be an industrial strength rather than a weakness, a direct contradiction of fascist ideology that claimed racial and gender homogeneity were necessary for peak industrial efficiency. For American society, the aircraft production miracle established a new understanding of what their economic system could achieve when fully mobilized toward a common goal. The production techniques and organizational methods developed during the war laid the groundwork for the consumer abundance of the post-war years, as factories converted from bombers and fighters to automobiles, refrigerators, and eventually television sets. More importantly, the wartime experience established an expectation that this abundance would be broadly shared, that the workers who produced the victory would participate in its economic fruits. This expectation shaped American labor relations and economic policy for a generation after the war, creating what economic historians call the Great Compression, a period of relatively equal income distribution and broadly shared prosperity that lasted into the 1970s. The most lasting legacy of America's aircraft production achievement may be its demonstration of how quickly industrial capacity can be created and redirected when necessity demands. In December 1941, American aircraft production capacity was approximately 2,000 planes per month, most of relatively obsolescent design. By July 1944, monthly production exceeded 8,000 aircraft, including the most advanced fighters and bombers in the world. This nearly fourfold increase in less than 3 years represents perhaps the most dramatic industrial mobilization in human history, an achievement made more remarkable by the fact that it occurred simultaneously with comparable expansions in shipbuilding, tank production, electronics, synthetic rubber, and dozens of other war-critical industries. This demonstration of industrial adaptability has influenced contingency planning for both military and civilian challenges ever since, establishing a confidence that production systems can be transformed more rapidly than previously thought, possible when properly organized and motivated. For the generation that witnessed this transformation firsthand, whether as participants, beneficiaries, or opponents, the aircraft production miracle became a defining experience that shaped their understanding of what modern industrial society could achieve. Wilhelm Messerschmitt, the brilliant aircraft designer whose name became synonymous with German fighter development, visited American aircraft factories in the 1950s as part of a technical exchange program. After touring the Boeing plant in Seattle, he reportedly remarked to his American hosts, "Now I understand why we lost. You defeated us, not with better aircraft, but with better factories. Not with what you built, but how you built it." This recognition, that production method rather than product design had been decisive, influenced German industrial recovery profoundly, as companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and eventually Messerschmitt Bölkow Blohm incorporated American mass production techniques while maintaining their traditional emphasis on engineering excellence. As the world entered the atomic age and then the space age, the lessons of wartime aircraft production continued to resonate. The Apollo program that landed humans on the moon represented a similar mobilization of industrial and technical resources toward a seemingly impossible goal, achieved through many of the same organizational principles that had produced victory in World War II. Wernher von Braun, the German rocket scientist who led much of America's space effort, explicitly cited the wartime production miracle as his model for managing the massive industrial undertaking of building the Saturn V rocket. What America achieved in aircraft production showed me that the impossible merely takes a little longer here, von Braun told a NASA management conference in 1962. The same production philosophy that built thousands of bombers can build the spacecraft that takes us to the moon. It is merely a matter of organization, resources, and will. This confidence, that seemingly impossible production goals could be achieved through proper organization, became a characteristic American approach to grand challenges throughout the 20th century, from wartime mobilization to space, exploration to medical research. For Hitler, whose mocking dismissal of Roosevelt's 60,000 aircraft pledge opened our story, the production disparity represented the most consequential misjudgment of his leadership. As Albert Speer later recalled, Hitler continued to believe almost until the end that some technological breakthrough would nullify America's industrial advantage, that quality would ultimately triumph over quantity. This belief reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of modern industrial warfare, where quantity, when produced with sufficient quality, becomes a quality of its own. The 296,000 aircraft that America produced during the war were not merely more numerous than Germany's 50,000. They were, by 1944, technically superior in most performance metrics as well, combining quantity with quality in a way that German industrial philosophy had deemed impossible. This combination represented not just a military advantage, but a refutation of fascist industrial theory, which had assumed that mass production necessarily meant inferior products, and that only authoritarian organization could achieve peak industrial efficiency. In the final analysis, America's aircraft production achievement represented more than just a triumph of machines or methods. It demonstrated the productive potential of a free society when unified by common purpose. The same democratic characteristics that fascist ideology had considered weaknesses, social mobility, respect for individual initiative, openness to talent regardless of background, and relatively equal distribution of economic benefits, proved to be industrial strengths when properly organized and motivated. This demonstration had profound implications for the post-war world, influencing not just economic development, but political evolution throughout Europe and Asia. As nations rebuilt from the devastation of war, many consciously adopted elements of the American production model while adapting it to their own cultural and economic circumstances, creating the foundation for the unprecedented global prosperity of the late 20th century. The ultimate irony of Hitler's mockery is that it revealed not just a failure of intelligence, but a poverty of imagination. When he sarcastically suggested that Roosevelt must be confusing real aircraft with Hollywood props, Hitler was projecting his own limitations. He simply could not conceive of production on the scale America would achieve. This failure of imagination proved more decisive than any battlefield defeat, as it led to a fundamental miscalculation of the strategic balance of power from the very beginning of America's entry into the war. By the time the reality became impossible to ignore, Germany had already committed itself to a two-front war against opponents, whose combined industrial capacity exceeded its own by a factor of more than 10 to 1. The aircraft that darkened the skies over Germany in 1944 and 1945, dropping more bombs in a single raid than the Luftwaffe could deliver in months of operations, represented the material manifestation of this strategic miscalculation, the physical evidence of an imagination gap that no tactical brilliance or individual heroism could overcome. For the generation that rebuilt the post-war world, the lessons of this achievement extended far beyond military applications. The organizational methods, production techniques, and management philosophies developed for aircraft production influenced everything from automobile manufacturing to consumer electronics to healthcare delivery. The post-war economic boom that transformed living standards across the developed world drew directly on wartime production innovations, creating an unprecedented era of broadly shared prosperity. Even more significantly, the demonstration that democratic societies could mobilize industrial resources more effectively than authoritarian regimes influenced the political evolution of dozens of developing nations, many of which had previously assumed that rapid industrialization required authoritarian control. This recognition that freedom and efficiency could be complementary rather than contradictory shaped the global contest between democracy and authoritarianism throughout the Cold War and beyond. Today, as we face new challenges requiring rapid industrial mobilization, from climate change to pandemic response to technological competition, the lessons of America's wartime production miracle remain relevant. The core insight that production systems can be transformed more rapidly and completely than previously thought possible when properly organized and motivated offers both hope and guidance for contemporary challenges. The aircraft that once rolled off American assembly lines at a rate that Hitler deemed impossible serve as a reminder that the boundaries of industrial possibility are often defined not by physical limitations, but by imagination, by our collective ability to envision and then create production systems that achieve what conventional wisdom considers impossible. In this sense, the 296,000 aircraft produced between Pearl Harbor and VJ Day represent not just a historical achievement, but a continuing inspiration, a demonstration of human productive potential that continues to influence us. Our understanding of what is possible when necessity and opportunity converge.